Ala Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, and welcome, dear friends, to Tolkien Untangled. So, in the last episodes, we talked about the cosmic beginnings of Tolkien's Legendarium, the beginning of the universe itself, as well as the formation of the planet Arda. And we also looked at the pretty psychedelic but very primeval age known as the Years of the Lamps, when the gods of Arda ruled over paradise. But as we discussed in the last episode, this primordial paradise does come to a very dramatic end. But what we really need to know for this episode is that the gods of Arda, the Valar is what they're called, have fled into the uttermost west, far away from the dark lands of Middle-earth, and there they've established a second realm, a second paradise for themselves that they call Valinor. But as I say, in the east are the war-torn lands of Middle-earth that exist in a perpetual state of night. And it's here that the god of darkness and discord, Melkor, rules as the first and frankly unopposed Dark Lord. So this episode, and this whole part of the story really, begins with Varda, the Lady of Light and the Queen of the Valar. And the way that Varda begins the story is by igniting the great constellations of stars above Middle-earth. And the most significant of all these constellations is the Valakirka, the Sickle of the Gods, which Varda hangs in the north as a threat above the Dark Lord's fortress of Utumno, and as a token of the doom of Melkor. Now, the reason that this marks the very beginning of our story is because at the very moment that Varda ignites these stars, thousands and thousands of leagues away, beside the waters of awakening, the first ever elf opens his eyes and enters into the world. And so, this is it. This is the first elf. This is the first sentient being that's not one of the Ainur, the divine spirits. And the first ever elves are actually not born, but they are laid down in the ground by their creator, Eru Ilúvatar. And there they sleep until the moment of their awakening. And that moment is now. See, at the exact moment that Varda kindles these new stars into existence, so awakens the first elf. And because, as I say, Middle-earth is stuck in darkness, the first thing that the first elf sees are these stars. And it should be noted that throughout the rest of the elves' history and culture, the stars are held in particular reverence. And Varda especially is beloved by the elves, and their name for her is Elbereth Gilthoniel, which means the Star Queen. Now, Elbereth Gilthoniel is one of those phrases that pops up again and again and again in Tolkien's writings, and in Lord of the Rings, both Aragorn and Frodo say it a bunch of times. And you'll also hear it in Lord of the Rings video games and anything really to do with elves and Middle-earth. But what it really refers to is this elven title for the goddess, Varda. But anyway, so our first ever elf awakens at a primeval place called Cuiviénen, and his name is Emin. And Emin literally means number one. But Emin is not the first for very long, because beside him lies his destined spouse, Eminye, which is just the feminine word for number one. But Emin and Eminye are not alone. The next to awaken is Tata and his spouse Tatie, and their names literally mean two, or second. And after them comes Enel and Enelye, and yep, you guessed it, their names mean number 3. So these 6 elves all awaken and explore Cuiviénen, and eventually they all meet and join up. And as they wander the surrounding forests, they stumble upon 6 more pairs of elves sleeping in the ground. So, Emin, being the eldest, being the first, he claims these elves as his people, and he wakes them, and they call themselves the Minyar, Now, a little while later, the elves encounter 9 more sleeping pairs, and Tata, being the second, he wakes them, and he claims them as his people, the Tatia. And not long after that, they chance upon a third group, this time 12 pairs, and they are woken and claimed by Enel, and they become the Nelia. So the now 60 elves spend a very long time just sitting on the shores of the water, and they invent all sorts of things like language and poetry and music, and they call themselves the quendi, which means those who speak with voices. For Tolkien says that as yet they had met no other living things that spoke or sang. But in time, the elves grew restless, and Emin especially, because his clan is by far the smallest. Now, in the Cuiviana, it was kind of an in-universe legend that Tolkien wrote for the elves to tell about their own awakening, so it's not necessarily canon, but it portrays Emin as being a little bit arrogant, to be honest, about the fact that he is the absolute first elf, and he seems to really want the largest clan. So, he decides that they should set out again. But Emin is a clever guy, and he was paying attention when Tata and Enel claimed their people. And he noticed that the size of the groups increased significantly with each one they found. So, Emin decided to be smart, and he volunteered to wait until last before claiming any new elves. So, when they all come upon 18 more pairs of elves, it is Tata who claims them and adds them to his folk. And when they encounter 24 more pairs, Emin tells Enel to go ahead and claim them as his own. Now, if any of you guys are a maths genius, you will know that we now have 144 elves, all living together in Cuivianen. And although Emin keeps searching tirelessly for this final group, they're never found. They never existed. And so the Minya remain forever the smallest of all the elven clans. And it's actually a kind of interesting side note here that for a long while, 144, that's the largest number the elves ever counted to. And so, in none of their future languages do the elves have any common words for any number larger than 144. Which, I don't know, I think is a pretty cool detail, to be honest. But anyway, unfortunately, in order for us to have a story, this simple time of peace and secrecy is going to have to come to an end. So, I said that the lands of Middle-earth belong to the Dark Lord Melkor? Well, tragically, he is the first one to discover the elves. Now, the first thing Melkor does is send shadows and evil spirits to watch and waylay any of the elves who strayed too far from the waters of awakening. And so the elves begin to tell stories of a terrible rider who hunted and devoured them in the dark. But Melkor does not kill the elves. No, his plan is somehow much worse. He captures them and imprisons them in the dungeons of Autumno. And here they are broken. Their flesh is tortured and their spirits are twisted, and from the bodies of these first elves, the fairest elves, Melkor breeds the first orcs. And it's actually written by Tolkien that of all Melkor's many atrocities, this, the corrupting of elves into orcs, is the vilest deed and the most hateful to Eru Ilúvatar. Now, I just want to take a moment here to try and explain the origins of the orcs, because this is quite a controversial topic, and a particularly confusing one when it comes to what Tolkien actually wrote. And it's made even more confusing by the movies, because of course they also kind of give us more than one origin story.
Do you know how the orcs first came into being? They were elves once, taken by the dark powers, tortured and mutilated.
So, I guess there are a few main theories. The first one is what I just said, that they're elves, and they get corrupted through torture and evil magic into orcs. But this raises a question. What happens to an orc's soul when it dies? When elves die, their body is slain, that's their hroa, but their spirit, their feia, travels to Valinor and awaits judgment in the halls of Mandos. So, if orcs are just corrupted elves, does that mean there's a section in the halls of Mandos for orcs? There might be, I don't know. Tolkien kept it deliberately vague, but it's weird to think about. Now, another theory is that orcs are made from men. And this answers the soul question because when a man dies, his or her spirit leaves Arda completely and goes to dwell with Eru Ilúvatar, and no one really knows what happens to it. But we know that not all orcs are made from men because there are orcs at this point in the story, and there are absolutely no men yet. Now, I guess a third theory, which we do kind of see in the movies, is that orcs are created out of the earth. Kind of like how the elves were. But this can't be it, because Tolkien tells us explicitly that only Eru Ilúvatar can create life. So this means that all the servants of evil must be corrupted from the soul of something that was already created by Eru. Now, I guess the most likely explanation is that it's a bit of all three. I would argue that probably orcs are made from both men and elves throughout their history, and I don't know, maybe there is a large section in the halls of Mandos for dead orcs. I don't know, Tolkien never tells us. But he does tell us that orcs later multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar. Which means sexually, right? As in men and women making babies. Which I also find really weird to think about. You never think about pregnant orcs or little baby orcs, but again, it's very possible. I mean, there's no reason why we can't speculate that perhaps half of Sauron's army are female. But orcs are just so bred for war that male and female look pretty much exactly the same. The truth is, there aren't any real definite answers when it comes to orcs, but I guess that's part of what makes them so terrifying. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but back to the elves at Cuiviénen. By the time the rest of the Valar learn that elves even exist, Melkor is already in a really strong position. You see, the Valar Oromë, that's the Lord of the Hunt, he is the first of the good guys to find the elves. But really, unfortunately, he too is a hunter upon a huge steed. And so many of the elves fear him and shun him, mistaking him for the Dark Lord, which is understandable to be fair. But Tolkien does tell us that those few who had the courage to stay perceived that the great rider was noble and fair, and the light of Valinor was in his face. And the noblest of the elves were drawn towards him. So actually, the elves spend about 35 years hanging out in Cuiviénen before Oromë even finds them. And before we go on, it's probably worth me clarifying that when Tolkien says 35 years, he's not talking about the planet rotating around the sun 35 times, which we would call 35 years, because there is no sun at this point in the story. So there is no passage of time in the same way that we reckon it. There's no day in Middle-earth, and everyone who lives there is immortal, so time is just relative, I guess. Who knew? Einstein was right. But Tolkien, he is such a nerd, and he does give us a really complex mathematical system for translating years of the Valar into, our actual human years. And you know what? I'm going to put it in the description because it's so mathematical and nuts. But take my word for it, 35 years in Valinor is actually about 335 years as we would reckon it. But anyway, when Oromë does eventually find the elves, he actually does it by accident. You see, of course Oromë is, as I say, the god of hunting. And that means he spends a great deal of time riding through the dark lands of Middle-earth, hunting the evil monsters of Melkor. And it just so happens that he's riding through the east when all of a sudden his great horse Nahar rears up and stands still. And Oromë hears the sound of singing. Now, if you'll allow me just one more tangent before we keep going, I have a great Tolkien fun fact. This one's a doozy. It's one of my favourite fun facts. So this event that I'm talking about, where Oromë discovers the elves, is written about by Tolkien in Chapter 3 of the Silmarillion. Now, obviously, we all know there are 3 published novels in Tolkien's Legendarium: the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings. Now, what's crazy is that in The Hobbit, elves are also introduced for the first time in Chapter 3, when Bilbo and the dwarves come to Rivendell. And, just like in the Silmarillion, before Bilbo sees the elves, he hears their song. And, even crazier, in Chapter 3 of Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo, Sam, and Pippin are wandering through the Shire when all of a sudden they encounter, for the first time, a wandering elf called Gildor and Glorion. Now, Gildor didn't make it into the movies, but in both the movies and the books, before the hobbits see the wandering elves, they hear their song. So, I don't want to read too much into what might just be a coincidence, but the number 3 does seem to be very significant in elven culture. Like, there are 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky. There are 3 clans of elves. We haven't got to it yet, but within one of those clans, the Noldor, there will be 3 princes who lead 3 factions to reclaim the 3 Silmarils. It just keeps on coming up, which is pretty cool. It's also cool that elves are always preceded for the first time by singing. Now that probably is quite significant. The elves love to sing, and they seem to draw a lot of their magic from these songs of power. Anyway, back to the actual story. So, although many elves fear Oromë, the wisest and noblest are drawn towards him. And Oromë quickly becomes very fond of these new children of Ilúvatar. So, after spending a fair bit of time with them, Oromë then hurries back to Valinor to tell the other Valar what he's found. And the other Valar have a council to discuss this, and what it means for them as gods of Arda to have new beings walking upon it. But Oromë doesn't stick around to discuss it with them. No, he hurries all the way back to Cuiviénen to be with the elves, and presumably to protect them. Now, Manwë, the king of all Arda, sits upon his throne atop Taniquetil, and he looks east at the dark lands of Middle-earth. And after a long while of contemplating, he makes a decision. And his decision is that for the sake of the elves, the Valar must, once again, take up the mastery of Arda to deliver it from the shadows of Melkor. So, that's exactly what happens. For the first time, the Valar, all of them, declare war on Melkor. And they go forth from the west in all their might to assail Melkor and defeat him, whatever the cost. Now, this war is called the War for the Sake of the Elves. But despite it being all about the elves, they don't fight in it. This is a clashing of gods. It's way too intense for anything that's not one of the Ainur. So the elves only watch from a distance, and in fact, they know almost nothing about the actual fighting, which means we know almost nothing about the actual fighting, and that's because the Silmarillion is written kind of as an elven history. It's their mythology, so we only know what they know. But what we do know is that the climactic battle in this war, the Titanic showdown, is called the Battle of the Powers, and it was almost apocalyptic. So the host of the West, that's the good guys, the Valar and their Maiar, clash against the hosts of the North, which is Melkor and all things evil. And in this battle, which takes place around Melkor's chief fortress Utumno, the land is utterly broken and destroyed. And for the rest of time, this place is a barren and lifeless land. But the destruction is worth it, because eventually the hosts of the North are beaten back into Utumno, where they are besieged. And after a long and grievous siege, the gates of Utumno are finally rent open and the halls are unroofed. And it's said that Melkor fled and sought refuge in the uttermost pit. Now, in the Grey Annals, which are a collection of Tolkien's notes published after he died, there's actually a reference to a sudden host of Balrogs that come forth in this hour and assail the standard of Manwë as it were a tide of flame. But and this is very cool. All these Balrogs were withered in the wind of his wrath and slain with the lightning of his sword. Now, as I say, this isn't in the Silmarillion, and it's one of Tolkien's later notes, so I can't really say if it's canon or not, but it's a really cool moment. This is something I'd like to see on film. You know, the king of the gods slaying a host of Balrogs with the power of his wind and lightning. That is good stuff, man. And as I say, Tolkien did write about it, so I totally choose to believe that Manwë did slay a host of Balrogs in this battle. Although, as we know from The Lord of the Rings, he doesn't kill them all, does he? And Tolkien later mentions there are at least 7 that survive the siege of Autumno. But they aren't here. And so, Melkor finally stands alone before the host of the West. And of course, of all the Valar to come forward to wrestle him, it is Tulkas, the champion. The same dude who took down Melkor the first time. And so, once the Dark Lord is utterly defeated, he is bound in a great and unbreakable chain called Angainor, and carried away to Valinor as a captive to face the judgment of his brother Manwë and the rest of the Valar. But there's one more thing I need to say, because in their haste to capture Melkor, the host of the West kind of neglects to empty the caverns beneath Melkor's second fortress, the Iron Prison of Angband. Now, this fortress is kept by Melkor's second-in-command and his chief disciple, Sauron. Now, Sauron is not alone in Angband. He has a whole host of orcs and those 7 Balrogs I mentioned just a second ago. But they all remain here in secret, safe beneath the ground, where they sort of go into hibernation, waiting for their master's eventual return. But anyway, back in Valinor, everything has gone wrong for Melkor, and he begs to be forgiven and is kind of let off the hook, really. But the Valar are not buying it, and Manwë sentences Melkor to 3 ages of imprisonment in the halls of Mandos. Now, Mandos is, of course, another one of the Valar. He is the Doomsman, which means he's in charge of prophecies and fate and all that kind of thing. But he also has another role. Mandos guards the halls of the dead, where elven souls will go if their bodies are destroyed. And his halls are completely inescapable. So, for 3 whole ages, Mandos watches over Melkor and keeps the Dark Lord imprisoned. And this means that for the first time since the destruction of the lamps, there is genuine peace throughout all of Arda. And because we have a rather rare happy ending here, this is where I'm going to finish this video. But fear not, because next time we're going to take a look at the great journey, the great migration of the elves from the uttermost east into the uttermost west. But as always, dear friends, thank you very much for watching, and make sure you hit that subscribe button just to ensure that you don't miss the next episode. And just before I go, there is just enough time for another quick little Tolkien fun fact. So today's fun fact is about Tolkien and his languages. And although I'm sure you're all aware that Tolkien created a ton of languages in his lifetime, 15 to be precise, not all the languages in Lord of the Rings are made up. You see, Rohirric, which is the language spoken by the men of Rohan, as well as the men of Dale and Laketown, is described by Legolas as rich and rolling like the land itself, but hard and stern as the mountains. However, this rich but stern language is actually just Old English, the real-life language spoken by the Anglo-Saxons, who were the first to rule the country we now call England. And what this means is that a lot of the words that we're very familiar with from Lord of the Rings are actually real words from the language that was once the origin of the language I'm speaking right now. So, for example, when the men of the north first met Mithrandir, they saw that he carried a great staff, and they perceived he was so wise that they assumed he must be an elf. So, the Old English word for magical staff is gand, from which we get the word wand. And the Old English word for elf is alf, So Gandalf literally means wand elf in Old English. Now similarly, Saruman, his Sindarin name, his elven name, is Curunir, which means man of skill. Now the Old English word for design or device or skill would be Searu. So Saruman is just Old English for man of skill, Saruman. And that's not all. Isengard actually means ringed guard or ringed garden. And Grima is an Old English word meaning mask, which is appropriate, I guess, considering Grima Wormtongue's deception and betrayal. Also, Shelob just means she-spider. Both lob and cob were Old English words for spider, and although they've now almost entirely fallen out of usage, we do still say cobweb, don't we? In fact, in Anglo-Saxon writings, we see a few familiar-looking names, including Gameling, Wiumtunga, and Skeedufiex, which are updated just a tiny bit by Tolkien into Gamling, Wormtongue, and Shadowfax. Isn't that amazing? That's what happens when a professor of Anglo-Saxon language writes a novel. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevaya Melanine.